Thank you very much, Harold, if you can still hear me. Hello, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. I'm a Florida boy. I grew up in Clearwater, and now I live in New York City. And just to clarify, young people's literature doesn't mean literature written by young people. It's literature for young people. Threatened is a book typically read by 12 and 13-year-olds, although more than half of my readers are adults by emails that I get, judging from that. So just a brief preface of how I came to write this book. I came across apes by accident. I wasn't writing conservation-themed books or about the environment, and I bought a pair of pants that were Bonobo's brand. Is anyone wearing any Bonobo's pants tonight? Yeah. You're wearing them tonight? Awesome. Thank you. They're actually pretty good, and they're famous for preventing diaper butt for men. You know how men get really saggy backs to their khakis? I bought the pants, and I tried them on, and I liked them, and then I Googled bonobos, and I thought it was a nonsense word. And then I found out about this species of ape that I'd never heard of. For a long time, anthropologists would look to the chimpanzee as our closest relatives. They share 98.7% of their DNA with people. And chimps have a number of very unattractive qualities. So if you want to peel back human culture and see what is human nature, and you look to the chimps, you find out that there's a lot of male-to-female aggression. There's infanticide, and then there's also, if you imagine 16 chimps living in the jungle, that group will grow and thrive to about 30 or 32. It'll split into two, and then after a year or two, those two tribes will go to war. Whichever one is stronger will pick off the weaker members of the other side. So if you want to see what a person is and you look at a chimp, it's pretty depressing, but no one was looking at the bonobos because no one really knew about them. They weren't really studied until the 1980s. And they're tied with chimps as our closest relatives, 98.7% of their DNA shared, but bonobos don't have those unattractive qualities that chimps have. There's no recorded instances of bonobos killing each other, and they're matriarchal, so the females are in charge, or more importantly, the mothers are in charge. So it's a great group to live in for mothers and children. But they only live in the country with the worst human conflicts since World War II. 5.4 million people have died in Congo since the 90s, and it was that disconnect that really brought me into it and made me write about the bonobos. So Endangered was my book about a girl surviving wartime with an orphan bonobo by her side. And then I was hooked on apes, I guess. So now I wrote another book about chimpanzees. Threatened is about a orphan ultimately surviving on his own in the jungle and finally finding family in an unlikely place with a group of non-humans, with chimpanzees. So I'm going to read to you from late in the book. It's actually different from what I read at the New School, so the gauntlet is thrown, other readers. I'm going to read to you late in the book. You're going to hear the name Omar. Omar is not a chimpanzee. He's a vervet monkey that hangs around camp. And I think that's all you need to know. My biggest struggle during the rainy season was to find logs dense and dry enough to smolder for days and keep Omar and me safe. I'd found that the best ones were near the river, where trees often fell over in the mud. I'd tie vines to a dead tree and cart it home like a buffalo with a plow, leaving the trunk beside the fire for days until it went from wet to damp. It would smoke dry while the inner logs burned. Then I'd eventually roll the tree towards the center and keep it there until it too began to burn. A dense enough log under the thick leaves of the kapok tree could stay lit through all but the worst rain showers. One evening, though, the twilight was an eerie green, and come sundown a savage storm began. As it raged, Omar was too excited to sleep, so we stayed up, listening to the thunk-thunk of the pelting rain as my roof leaked into the cup and pot. The corduroy skin on Omar's hands and feet had broken out in a rash, and without a full day of dry weather anywhere on the horizon, it would be a long time before it cleared up. I stroked his fur as we sat in the dark. Toward morning, I heard a loud crash and knew I'd have another fallen tree to harvest for my fire. The dawn sky was the smooth gray blue of a river stone. Once I'd had my tea, I went with Omar toward where we'd heard the crashing sound. The fallen tree was massive, and I knew I'd never be able to move it or cut off any but the smallest branches with my machete. But there was still plenty of fuel to be had. I set to work chopping off the ragged yellow pieces of wood where the tree had split and carrying those back to my fire pit. With the chimps away, the jungle was relatively quiet, and the repetitive task of going back and forth to the fallen tree put me in a trance. I got so involved in my work that I didn't notice Omar was no longer with me until I got hungry for my next meal hours later. "Omar," I called, but there was no response. Meal forgotten, I retraced my steps, calling his name. I finally heard his chirp in response and found him in the open space along the fallen tree. He discovered some rotten fruit there and was slurping down the worm-ridden globs. I dashed over and batted the mushy black goo from his hands. He looked up at me in shock. I'd always counted on him to feed himself, but even the hungriest wild monkey would never eat food so clearly rotten. I headed back to camp, expecting Omar to follow, but he didn't. He sat down. So I picked him up and carried him back to the lagoon. He was limp in my arms. As we went, I examined his paws. The rash had settled into the grooves of his childhood injury and was blooming outward in bursting red tendrils. All of it was plastered together with pus. I kissed the top of Omar's head. It's going to be okay. I stopped collecting wood and spent the day focused on him, massaging his tender hands as much as he would permit and holding him near the fire in an attempt to dry the rash. I chewed the leaves away from wild celery and fed the monkey the stalks, his favorite part. He held on to each piece gingerly, wincing at the pressure on his inflamed hands. Afterwards, I fed him from my stash of nuts, and he nibbled directly from my fingers. Before night fell, I carried him to the river and bathed his arms and legs as best as I could, hoping that might help the infection. He accepted the attention, watching as I cleaned his fur and patted it dry. Then we lay out by the fire, warming our fingers and staring up into the night sky. Omar nodded to sleep in my arms, huddled near for warmth until the shivering subsided. The next day, he dozed in the house while I puttered. I tidied the site, collected more wood, filled out my garden. When he woke, Omar sat near the fire pit with its one smoldering log, his hands held out to the drying flames, the monkey who loved fire. Thank you.